Well, thank you guys. It's good to be back here. I'm, again, Eddie Wu. I work at NC State, if you don't know, and I am a PhD student at the seminary up there at Wake Forest. So my studies generally do involve apologetics, and specifically the problem of evil is my favorite topic, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to start you guys off with a little bit of review. And then for the rest of the night, I want to give you guys a broad overview of all the different positions on this topic. Maybe you're here because this topic caught your attention. Maybe you're a Christian and you're thinking to yourself, how do I think about the problem of evil? It's something that I have to deal with. It's something that maybe my unbelieving friends struggle with. Maybe you're an unbeliever and you're here. And maybe this is the biggest stumbling block for you as a Christian, or for the Christian faith. You just can't get past how there could be so much evil in the world, and yet, how could God exist, right? That's the classic conundrum here. How can God be who he says he is, and yet there's so much evil in the world? So let me give you guys a quick review. Last time we talked about the different types of evil. If you remember, there are 3 types. There's the moral, so this is me committing an evil against somebody else. My pastor is not here, so unfortunately I can't stab him anymore this afternoon, or tonight, so I'm going to stab my friend Jackson up here in the front row. So if I stab Jackson, that is an example of moral evil, one agent committing evil to another agent, right? Then you have natural evils. These are things like hurricanes, tornadoes, so on and so forth. And then finally, physical evils. If you remember, these are things like cancer, sickness, disease, things like that. Whatever your response to the problem of evil, you have to deal with all 3 types. And it's not just evil, we also could classify these as sufferings. Why do people suffer so much, right? You may think about someone in your family, maybe someone you're close to, maybe even a friend. They're suffering. Maybe it's from illness. Maybe it's from another person. Why, God? Because if God is truly who he says he is, if he is all-powerful, if he's all-loving, if he is even all-knowing, how could a loving God let this happen? If you remember in the Christian faith, we believe that there are 3 types of attributes for God. I didn't put these in my slides, but I'll go over these again with you. The first one was omnipotence. And remember, this is God's powerfulness, the ability to do all things that are logically possible, right? Because God is limited in some way, not because of his nature, but because of who he is. He is a logical God. God won't do things that are illogical. Remember the classic one? Could God create a rock so heavy that even he couldn't lift it? Well, of course not. That's an absurd statement. How could God do something like that? That makes no sense at all. God can do all things that are logically possible. God's also omniscient. If you remember, that means that God knows all things, past, present, and future, right? So God knows that you woke up this morning. He knows that you came here and you're here presently. And then afterwards, you're going to get some ice cream from Hal and Cal. Is that still open late this night? Oh, nice. I need to get some on my way out. All right. God knows all these things, right? Because God is omniscient. He knows all things that are logically possible to be known. And then finally, the big sticking point, God is omnibenevolent, meaning God is all-loving and all-good. We have to keep all 3 attributes of God. He's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. If we lose any one of those 3, you no longer have the Christian God. You have something else completely. So the problem of evil is really an argument against Christianity. It's a way to say, Christian, how can you claim that your God, who is omnipotent, omniscient, and all-loving and all-good, how can he exist in this world where there is so much evil? And maybe you feel this tension, right? You look into the world, you watch the news. I gave you an example of me stabbing Jackson over here. There are significant examples that we can point to that we look and say, man, there appear to be a lot of evils. And sometimes the evil doesn't seem fair. Sometimes I suffer and Jackson doesn't. But then sometimes it's vice versa. Jackson suffers a lot more than I do. How is this fair, God? How is it that even the most innocent among us suffer, specifically children, That's a tough one, a really tough one for us to deal with. As Christians, we need to have an answer. Another quick review. Last week we talked about two different problems. The first one was the logical. This one went, if God is omnipotent, he could prevent evils from occurring. If God is omnibenevolent, or all good, he would prevent evils from occurring. And then finally, evil exists. The logical argument was said to be an inconsistency between those 3 points. How can God be omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and yet evil exists? Those don't seem to be logically possible. But if you remember, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga came up with what he called his free will defense. And he said, well, there is a way for these things to be logically compatible. God may have given us free will, the ability to make choices, right? And I remember I said, it's my ability to choose to stab Jackson. I have that choice inherent within me. So I go and stab my friend Jackson over there. That's a free choice that's given to me. So because of that, that's one reason to believe God allows evil into the world. But then we ran into a more difficult problem. Does anyone remember what the name of that one was? Starts with an E. Not emotional. Good try though, Jackson. I'll stab you later. Evidential. Very good. Yeah, there's another problem by a guy named William Rowe. He came up with what he calls the evidential problem. And he essentially says, when you look out into the world, when you look at all the evidence of evil and suffering, the evidence would seem to tip the probabilities, would tip the scales in the favor of atheism. Because when we look into the world, we see all these instances of evil. Again, think all of them. From the little girl that suffers, to hurricanes that batter Western North Carolina, to the Holocaust, to whatever, name your pick. Evil seems to be very, very present. And not just very present, the evils seem to be gratuitous. You guys remember that word from last time? A gratuitous evil. A gratuitous evil is an evil that seems to have no purpose. In other words, why would God allow evil to occur if it doesn't have a purpose? This leads to our last point here, the greater good theodicy. This is where we ended last time. Most Christians believe in a theodicy or a response that they call the greater good theodicy. This theodicy claims that for every evil that God allows, he allows it because there is a greater good yet to come. In other words, God has allowed this to happen so that a greater good happens later. I'm going to stab Jackson again. Lots of stabbing of Jackson tonight, unfortunately, my friend. I stab Jackson. God allows me to do that because God could stop me, right? There is nothing preventing God from stopping me stabbing Jackson. That seems well within his power as needed. God allows me to stab Jackson because God has already planned a greater good that's going to come from it. So Jackson goes to the hospital. He meets his wife. He wins $1 million because of the lawsuit. That seems like a pretty greater good to me, right? Is that pretty good to you, Jax? All right, Jax likes it. All right, that's a greater good, right? It's something that's greater than the evil that's allowed. Last week, we pointed out some of the issues with the greater good, right? How do we know who the good goes to? Does it always go to the one who suffers? Or does it go to somebody else? Where is the greater good sometimes? Sometimes we don't see the greater good. We left off here because I wanted you to sort of think and dwell on it. Maybe you didn't. That's fine. It's finals week. I get it. But the greater good is the most popular response by Christians. I'm going to give you some pushback tonight on a lot of different positions. I'm not saying that you cannot hold any one of these positions. In fact, if you want to hold to a greater good, that is totally fine. That is well within your right. Christians throughout history have held the greater good, and I think they've done so because they believe it's a really good solution. I think there are some problems that we need to recognize and acknowledge with the greater good. As we go through the list of the different ways to respond to the problem of evil, I want you guys to be aware, no matter your position, there will be some problem with it, including mine that I'll share at the end. No position is perfect. Every position brings with it theological and philosophical baggage. In other words, things that just kind of make you go, ew, I don't like that. I don't like the conclusion it gets me to. Your job is not to believe what I believe. If you want to, great, more converts. If you don't, that's okay. I want you to pick a position and a response that works for you. Why? Because at some point in your lives, you will have to deal with the problem of evil for yourself. At some point, you will deal with suffering, either in your own life or the life of those close to you, and you will have to know why God does or allows these things to happen. It has to be a response that's satisfying for you. So maybe you have no problem with the greater good. Sounds great. That's your prerogative, but you still have to deal with the theological problems that come with it. All right? Why else do we do this? I also believe, at least for my professor's sake, that your intellectual response will naturally answer your emotional response. Remember last week I talked about emotional versus intellectual, right? The emotional is this cry to God. God, why? Why let these evils occur? I'm hurting. I'm suffering. Life is hard. And intellectual is kind of the exercise we're doing today. We're going through these different responses. We're trying to figure out why God would allow these things from a more intellectual standpoint. I think what we do tonight intellectually will naturally lead itself to the emotional. My professor wrote in his book, a person's theodic framework, or his answer, guides him in answering the tough questions of those who are suffering and provides some comfort. Unless one has a coherent framework within which to give that help, one might unintentionally end up saying things that are not true of God or his ways. So our response, whatever your response is, it's good for you because it's going to naturally lead to how you emotionally respond. In fact, how you think, especially in that distress, is going to help shape your response to the problem of evil. But also, if your response is not clear, theologically or philosophically, then we run the biggest hurdle of all. We might say things that are incorrect about who God is. As Christians, we don't have that right. If we're going to speak truthfully about God, we need to speak that way, truthfully and clearly about who God is. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run through a bunch of these, and then I'm going to give you guys some time. Because last time I talked too much, and I don't want to talk that much again. My voice is kind of boring. So I want to give you guys time to think about some things as well. But first, let's talk about some of the issues with a greater good theodicy. We touched on these last time, but I want to get into a bit more detail this time. I told you we kind of dive in deep. I'm not trying to rag on it just because I want to rag on it. I want to be honest with the problems that the greater good has. If you want to hold it in spite of the problems, you have every right to do so. It is your responsibility then to deal with these problems intellectually. So first, there were 3 verses that were used to support the greater good. The first one was Genesis 50:20. If you remember, this is the story of Joseph in Genesis, right? When he's sold into slavery by his brothers, and it's just a bad situation all around. And then he says, well, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. I believe here that the good cannot be removed from its context. In other words, Joseph is not describing a law of God. He is just describing what happened to him. This is not a universal rule. We would call this a descriptive versus a prescriptive verse in Scripture. What do I mean? Descriptive means that we're just simply, the Bible is just telling you what happened. These people existed, they did these things. Descriptive. Prescriptive is like, you should do this. It's a way that the world actually is. I believe Genesis 50:20, Joseph is not talking about prescription. He's just giving you a description of what happened. There was good that came from that evil. What about Job? We talked about this last time. Remember, Job lost his family, he lost all of his animals, he was afflicted with sores. The only thing that was left for Job was his wife, and she wasn't a great help for him either, unfortunately. What about Job? Because he gains a lot back at the end. I think Job also presents a very specific and contextual situation. We can't apply this universally. In other words, can we make a universal claim that there is always a greater good that comes out of it, just looking at the verse alone? I don't think so. It looks like Job did get a greater good, but that doesn't mean that happens every time. And then finally, the most popular verse here is Romans 8:28. For those who love God, all things work together. This would seem to indicate a greater good. But the verse is very specific. Who is the verse directed towards?
To Christians.
To Christians, to those who love God. And so we would say, yes, Romans 8:28 does seem to give us a sense of a greater good. It would seem to say that the greater good for the Christian is at least heaven. We at least one day get to be with Christ in a perfect creation one day. That's a greater good for sure. The greatest good, one could even say. But wait a second, that doesn't really give us a lot of answers for the non-believer. How do we comfort them? How do we explain why God allows suffering for them? Is it just because life sucks for them? Doesn't seem like a great answer. I don't think that's how God operates, right? What other issues do we have with the greater good beyond the verses that don't seem to say what we want them to say? Well, first of all, how do we know if the good has even been applied? I stabbed Jackson. Jackson gets stabbed. He goes to the hospital. But it's not until maybe 25 years later that he finally gets $1 million, wins it in the lottery, right? Super lucky, 25 years later. Is that the good that was applied to me stabbing him 25 years prior? How do you know? How can you make the connection between two separate events? How do you calculate the amount of good that's needed to justify the evil? So remember, greater good says God allows evil to occur. He allows these things to happen because there's a greater good. The good in proportion is significantly better than the evil in question. How do we know how to calculate that? What's the calculus? Some of you guys are math majors or engineers, and you're thinking like, yeah, if I just, carry the one here or do something, I'll get a good calculus here. How can you know that? Is $1 million really that great for Jackson, for me to stab him? Another one, why not commit the worst of evils? So this is kind of a weird one. Let me explain how this one works. If God allows a greater good from an evil, then why shouldn't we just commit the worst of evils? Why shouldn't I stab, shoot, and maybe drop the hammer on Jackson? I should escalate the amount of evil that's done, because if God allows it, clearly there's going to be an even greater good that comes from it. Remember, if the good is greater, then why not try to get the greatest goods possible? We're actually doing you a favor here by committing more and more horrific evils. Okay, that doesn't seem quite right. Something about that just seems off. Why not allow evil to occur? So maybe some of you are thinking, yeah, I want to stop evil, right? I need to go stop, like if I'm about to stab Jackson, you're going to tackle me in the street and make sure I don't get a chance to stab Jackson. But wait a second. By stopping me from stabbing Jackson, he doesn't get the greater good anymore. He doesn't get the $1 million or meet his wife. What are you doing? Yeah, why would you prevent Jackson from meeting the love of his life? He's been waiting all year for this. And you stopped it, right? Why shouldn't we just allow evil to occur? Because if there's a greater good that's tied into the specific evil, let it happen, and then we'll see what happens, right? If the good from the evil is necessary, then maybe the evil is necessary too. This is a question of logic, and it questions God's logic. In other words, if God allows that evil to occur, me stabbing Jackson, he allows that to occur because he's already planned for the good to occur, that evil is necessary. In other words, it's not possible for Jackson to receive that good unless I stab him. That is a necessary thing. It must happen. Must it? Should it? Tough questions to ask about who God is and his character in that moment. And then finally, this is the tough one. How can you avoid God being ultimately the author of evil? If you remember at the beginning, I said that God was omnipotent. He's all good and all loving. And what that means conclusion-wise is that God cannot create evil. Maybe you want to go down that route. Personally, I don't. That's not the kind of God I want to worship and the God I want to serve. A God who creates and orchestrates evil. I believe God is all good. There is nothing bad or evil that comes from him, because that's truly a God that is worthy of my worship. He's holy, we could say. But if God has already planned all these greater goods, but they have to require these evils, then wait a second. Isn't God the one that's ultimately authoring all of this from the start? Is he not the one that's creating all this evil in the first place by allowing it? Remember, God could have stopped it. There is nothing, I think, that is too hard for God to stop between me stabbing Jackson. I think God is well within his power to prevent me from doing that. He could make me trip. He could just smite me on the spot. Any number of options here at play. Is God not the author of evil if we take this all the way back logically? In other words, we look and just make a connection point all the way back. Is it not God who orchestrates and authors everything? And if that's true, is he then not the author of evil? And if that's the case, I don't really like that conclusion very much, personally. Yes, sir.
So, would it be considered evil to kill somebody in self-defense?
No, we would not say so.
So, if an act was necessary to bring about a greater good, why call that evil?
Because of the act itself. The morality of that act is evil. So we would not say that if I were to kill Jackson because Jackson charged at me, that is certainly not evil. Now, there may be suffering involved. Jackson suffered. I stabbed him in self-defense. But the morality of it is not evil in that sense. So what I'm talking about are clear cases of evil. Think things like the Holocaust. Think things like the two examples that Ro gave us last week of Sue or Bambi. We would say those would seem to be evil.
See, that's the thing. The perception of an evil occurring, if there's an actual justification for it that we're simply not aware of, why even, like, does that not call into question whether anything that we consider to be evil is evil?
Yeah, so you're bringing up the question. Is there actually evil? That seems to be the toughest one, because I would say yes. It seems like there are clear cases of evil in the world. You may say, well, give me a definition. I would just say, because I see it. It's one of those, like, I don't have to give you a definition, because when I look at the world, I can just say that's pretty dang evil. The girl who was raped and killed by her mother's boyfriend, that seems to be a pretty clear case of evil. That's sort of what we're talking about here. We're not really discussing gray areas of what is evil, what's not. Because when the atheist pushes back, they're basically saying, yeah, I have clear evidence of evil. Look in the news. Look at the suffering that seems to happen. Remember that point that we brought up with the logical problem? The last point of that was evil exists. You may want to push back on that and say, well, maybe evil doesn't exist. We don't know what's actually evil. That's a question of what we call epistemology. How can we know whether something is evil? But now we're kind of like playing with semantics now at this point. For most of the atheists, they would just simply say, yeah, I see evil. I think this is pretty clearly evil. Let's not play with words here. The girl who was raped and killed seems to be a pretty clear-cut case. I don't know how you can say that's not evil, right? Now, there are maybe what we call some borderline scenarios. Jackson runs at me, I stab him. Was that self-defense? Was that premeditated? Who knows? We're talking more of the clear case. I go and stab Jackson because I want his money from his wallet. Seems to be a pretty clear-cut case of a moral evil at that point, right?
It still feels like the context matters in one scenario, but not in the other.
Sure, but again, it's not just about context. Right, right.
God, it seems like the context didn't.
Well, it's not just about context. It's the fact that there are evils. And so we could debate context all day, but the atheist is just going to push back and say, I have two examples here. Tell me what happens to Sue. Is that evil or is it not? And if it is, where's the greater good that comes from it, right? He's not arguing context anymore. He's saying, this seems to be clearly evil. Sue is unfortunately raped, tortured, and killed by her mother's boyfriend. There is no context here. This just seems to be clear-cut evil. Why does God allow that to happen? And we have many such examples throughout history. So it's not just about whether something is evil or not. That's a whole different question. We're dealing with there are evils in the world. How do we address those?
Would answering that not be providing the context?
Somewhat. You could answer it with the context of like, well, what about this context? What about this? But now you're doing that for every instance. Think things like the Holocaust. Much harder to provide context. Like, is this actually evil? I think the easiest thing to do is to just say yes and move on. Because when we start debating context, now we're losing sight of the actual question itself. Why does God allow it? All right? So here's some problems with the greater good. Again, maybe these aren't problems for you. I think they bring up some theological questions, at least for me, and some philosophical questions as well. All right, I'm going to bring up another one. After this, I want you guys to discuss what I would call both the pros and the cons of each position. So I'm going to break it up in like little groups. The next position is what's called the veil of soul making, popularized by a guy named John Hicks. He says that God allows evil in the world because as humans, we're not created perfectly. So in other words, you have some growing up to do, some maturing, if you will. You need to develop virtues, things like courage, patience, endurance. And the only way to do that is to experience evil. So Jackson is a pretty proud man, but he hasn't lived a full life yet. Me stabbing Jackson allows him to now learn perseverance, fortitude, endurance, and suffering. He would never learn that without me stabbing him. John Hicks says, since we're not created perfect from the start, our souls need to be refined. In other words, we need to be tested through the fires of suffering. You can kind of find this in things like Peter, maybe a little bit of James, talking about how we suffer. All right, let me give you guys a few minutes. Discuss amongst yourselves. I'm going to bring you guys back like 2 or 3 minutes. What are some pros? And then what are some cons? I'm not asking you to adopt this position. I'm just asking you to think about it honestly and then come back with some critical thoughts. All right? 2 to 3 minutes. Go. Little groups, 2 or 3, right where you are. All right, bring it back in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Very nice. All right, real quick, give me some pros of this position, if you have any. Maybe you didn't like any of it. Give me some pros here. Someone had to like something about it. Yeah, Julian.
I think it can be used well in a lot of smaller scenarios, like say you get beat up, and then you learn that you can actually take a punch, and you're like not as scared anymore.
Okay. Yeah, so you lose your fear. Yeah, for sure. Courage, you build courage as a result. Yeah, absolutely.
It explains our current sin without having to go all the way back to Adam.
Okay, explains our current sin. I'm going to go all the way back to Adam, to creation. Good. All right, give me some cons. Jax?
It seems like, Nick brought this up, but it seems like there will be some evils that you could say, like if I got stabbed and then that made me tougher mentally, I guess. Something else could have happened that wasn't quite so evil for me to build some mental toughness, perchance.
Yeah, why does the evil that occurs to build this virtue have to be so significant? Could I not build the same virtue without having such a significant evil or suffering in my life?
I'm thinking like, what if the suffering, say it was death, cuts off a life before it gets a chance to grow from the experience?
Yeah, it's a classic one, right? What if you die before you get a chance to develop these virtues? And clearly you haven't gotten that good.
Oh, so before I say my point, what's John Hicks' background?
Universalist.
Okay, all right, so in that case, I'd argue this is, well, I mean, regardless of the case, I'd say this is an extremely heretical viewpoint. I don't think a Christian can hold this viewpoint because it spits in the face of creation and the fall.
Yeah, John Hicks is a universalist, meaning he believes that at some point all people, regardless, will end up in heaven. That's what universalism believes. As most traditional Christians, we would hold that there is a heaven and hell, and those are eternal. They last forever. John Hicks believes that if a person dies and goes to hell, at least on his view of soul making, because they're in the fires of hell, their souls are being refined there. So eventually, they choose God. That's sort of his way of understanding how this works.
Why is evil necessary at all in order to build those character traits?
Yeah, you could probably develop courage or patience without needing to suffer. Like, do I need to have cancer to really get better or at, patience or fortitude? Maybe not. Yes, sir.
I was going to say one thing, like someone else mentioned, more specifically, it can't explain murder at all. Because if you die, then there's nothing for you to find.
Yeah, that's right. You died and you've lost your chance to be refined in the world. Jack's last one.
I think going back to what Joe said, I don't think Christians can hold it for a different reason. I also think, wouldn't there be an issue with the Holy Spirit versus evil, and then, seems to be some sort of distinction as to an experience causing growth and perseverance / the Holy Spirit sanctifying.
Oh, okay. So Jackson is bringing out this idea of, is it the Holy Spirit that develops these things in Christians? As Christians, we would believe that it's the Holy Spirit. He works in our lives through sanctification, allowing us to grow. Or is it evil that we actually need to grow in our lives? Hard to tip those scales, right? All right, next position. I'm going to go through these pretty quick, but I want you guys are doing great. I love it. Next position comes from a guy named Stephen Wystra, called skeptical theism. This is the one that was brought up last week quite a bit. It is a version of the greater good. In fact, a lot of these are versions of the greater good, but this is a direct descendant of the greater good argument. Wystra believes that God always brings good out of evil. He has to. However, we cannot always see the good because of our own, what he calls epistemic limitations. A big word. All it means is our epistemology. How can we know that there is actually a good that comes out of this evil? Maybe we don't always see it. He gives two examples, the analogy of flies and the analogy of the parent-child, to describe why we can't see the good. Let me give you guys how this works. With the flies, he says, look into a garage. You guys have all seen garages, right? Okay, good, just making sure. If there is an elephant in the garage, can you clearly see the elephant? Okay, good, it's not a trick question. You can clearly see an elephant in a garage. Imagine now that there are flies in the garage. Can you always clearly see those flies? Probably not. He says the goods are like the fly. We just can't see them because we are limited by our eyesight, our epistemology is what he would say. We look into the garage, and because we don't have super great vision to magnify everything, how can we actually see the goods? They're there, the flies are there, but how can we actually see that the flies are there? He also uses another analogy, that of a child and a parent. Me and my wife, we have two children, Millie and Oliver. They're 8 and 6, and they're getting way too big, way too fast. But we often take our kids to the doctor because they need to get shots, right? They need to get all the vaccines and whatever else that they need to survive in this world. Or they get sick, right? And they need to get a shot to feel better. Maybe they have the flu or something like that. Does my child at 8 or 6 understand why they're getting a shot? No. They just know it hurts. It hurts a lot. That's all they know. But as a parent, do I know why my child is getting a shot? Yeah, right? I know it's because it's for their good. It's so that they can live and prosper. Wystra says that God is like the parent and we are like the child. We suffer and we endure evils, and we may not know why, but God knows. And like a child, our knowledge of why is limited. Just like my child. I can tell you, my child is very limited in the knowledge they have. They don't know everything, even though they would say they do. But all we know is that it hurts. We know there's pain. We don't always know why there's so much pain. So in this sense, the greater good is there. There is a greater good, right? I get the shot, and then that's a good that I get. But I have to go through pain first in order to get that. That's Stephen Weistra's skeptical theism. This is the newest brand of the greater good that's out there. It's probably the most popular version that is there now. Where's the good? Well, it's there. We just may not always see the good. All right, 2 to 3 minutes. Discuss pros and cons. Go. All right, great. Let's bring it in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Nice. I know it's quick. I just want to give you guys a chance to think about it and discuss it. Pros. I think there's some pros here. Give me some pros.
It explains the problems.
Yeah, it provides at least some explanation, right? Anything else?
General, I like the parent-child analogy. That's pretty useful.
Yeah, it's a pretty common analogy. God is like a parent. We are like a child. His ways are above ours, right? He knows things that we simply cannot. Okay. We also read that in Job when he starts talking about like the Leviathan. Things get really weird at that point, but it's one of my favorites. When God's like, I know all these things. You don't. Stop questioning me, right? Julian?
It gets around some of the problems we had with the more general case for the greater good.
Okay.
So get away from some of the more general problems, all right?
You already mentioned it with Joe, but it coheres well with Romans 9 with the clay and potter analogy.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and sort of the epistemic limitation coheres well with the creator distinction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right, give me some cons. Are there any problems you see here? You can't prove it. Yeah, it's a pretty big one. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's not really like any evidence that this argument is bad. It's just rhetorically ineffective from an outside perspective. Like say you're chatting with an atheist about this, from their perspective, it just looks like an assertion, and nothing's really done to demonstrate that it's true. So it's pretty similar to.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like if I'm talking to somebody else, I'm just like, yeah, the goods are there. I don't know where they are, but they're there. Okay, nice. We're not really getting anywhere with this conversation.
I was gonna say, adding on to what you said, actually, one more thing, like, a scientist, atheist, or someone who puts a lot of trust in science would, the scientifically correct term for this is that it's not falsifiable.
Yeah, we can't prove it wrong, right? Let me give you my biggest problem with this version of the greater good, what's called skeptical theism. Just to clarify, skeptical theism does not mean you're skeptical about theism. It's a really weird name. It just means we don't know whether the goods can be seen or not. That's why they call it skeptical theism. My biggest problem is what I call an ontological problem. I brought that word up last week. Ontological just simply means a thing's being. What does it mean to be something? Evil, we would say, has a pretty large seeability. The elephant has a very large seeability. In other words, I can see the elephant clearly. I can see a lot of cases of evil. The girl who's raped and killed, the Holocaust, the hurricane that goes through western North Carolina, right? I can see those very clearly. So the evil seems to have a very clear seeability, or very high seeability, we would say. What kind of good are we talking about here? Greater. If something is greater ontologically, that's a big word. All I'm saying is if the good seems to be even better than the evil, then why can I not see the good? Why is the good's seeability not as clear as the evil when the good is supposed to be greater than the evil? Why does the evil seem so clear to me in my face? Maybe it doesn't convince you. That's fine. I'm just pointing out something that I have a problem with this, and it's a very philosophical problem. Yes, sir?
I just wanted to say something that I would say to that argument is, I think we were talking in the
I heard in the Divine Simplicity lecture that evil is described often as like the absence of good.
Correct.
So maybe the evil stands out more because it's the absence of the good that's more common.
Sure. Yeah, so that's one way to get around that, right? You could say, well, evil is the absence of good. I know what people are getting at when they say that. I don't know that I fully agree. And the only reason I say that is because from my experience, when evil happens, it really seems like there's something there. It seems like it's not just an absence, but there is something occurring that is evil. Now, you can push back and say, well, no, I do think evil is the absence of good. That's fine. I'm just saying it from my point of view. I find that hard to argue in terms of, especially when we're talking to people who are suffering, especially when they go through evil. It's hard to be like, well, that just wasn't actually there. It was just the absence of good.
I suppose you could argue that humans have a regularly occurring cognitive bias that predisposes us towards pointing out things that are evil or negative in some way.
Yeah.
And maybe we would have an easier time paying attention to good if we didn't have that bias.
Okay. Yeah, so we would call that man's distortion, the effects of the sin, noetic effects, we would say. In other words, because we believe in the fall, man is not perfect, we are marred by sin, maybe we just can't see the good because we're so marred by it, right? The sin is what prevents us from seeing the good. Maybe you want to hold that. I still don't. Again, it's primarily for an ontological reason. I believe I can see good. In fact, I think we do actually see goods at times. I think we can see goods even if you're not a Christian. I think atheists can see goods. If that's the case, then why can't I not still see it if it's supposed to be greater than the evil? Is it maybe something that's happening later in life, 25 years after I stabbed Jackson? But then you run into the problems of how do we connect the two together still? Again, this is a position that most people hold currently. This is Weistera's big response back to Roe, skeptical theism. He believes that this at least gets us an answer back to the atheist, to have a reason for the faith that we hold. I don't hold skeptical theism. That's fine. You may. I think this is a perfectly valid position to hold. There are a lot of great Christians who hold this position currently. I do think there are still some problems you have to deal with. Again, if you can deal with them, that's fine. I just find them a little too much for me to want to deal with. All right? Last one. Open theism. It's by a guy named William Hasker. This is a fun one. He simply says that God does not or limits himself from knowing the future. If God does not know the future, then he cannot be held responsible for evils that occur. He would still say God's omniscient. He doesn't deny that. But his definition of omniscience means that God simply just cannot know the future. In other words, it's logically possible for God to know the past and the present, what's happening now. But it is not logically possible for God to know the future because the future hasn't happened yet. Therefore, that's not logically possible in his mind. There are a couple of Bible verses that are usually brought up to support this. I'll read these to you just so you can kind of, stew on these for a bit. Genesis 6:6 says, "And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." Can God regret something that he's already done? Does it feel like God maybe didn't see something happening? Genesis 22:12. He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him." This is Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac. "For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Exodus 32:14. "And the Lord relented from the disaster that he has spoken of bringing on his people." God said he was going to do something, and then he changed his mind, it seems. And then finally, Jonah 3:10. "When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he said he would do to them, and he did not do it." So did God have something in mind and then change his mind? Did God not know what was going to happen in the future? That's open theism. 2 to 3 minutes. Go. Okay, let's bring it back in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right. Fantastic. Again, I'm cutting you short just because time is short. Time is money. Money is pizza. So, give me some pros here. Why would you ever want to hold to open theism, Julie?
Like the last one, it also gets around some of the problems with greater good theodicy.
Yeah, that's right. If God simply just doesn't know what's going to happen, then, well, it's not his fault that evils occur, right? So, okay, he's off the hook. All right, anyone else? Any other pros you want to throw in there? That's kind of about it, yeah. That's just usually where most people land, to be honest. All right, give me some of your cons.
If you hold this position when you die, you might find yourself in a very toasty place after.
Yeah, it's pretty heretical. You do deny an essential part of God's omniscience as traditionally understood.
It's also like a denial of clear prophecy in the Bible.
Yeah.
From the very beginning, Jesus or God talks about how the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. So basically, this is saying that God was able to predict in the hundreds of prophecies that Jesus would fulfill, and it just kind of worked out for him.
Yeah, essentially all of the prophecies in Scripture, including things like Revelation, that's, we say it hasn't happened yet. It's just God's a really great guesser, really good guesser. Maybe he's within his power to do so. I don't know. Seems a little bit of a stretch.
So it's similar to that point, but more broadly speaking, I find it hard to believe that as much as God already knows compared to people about the past and present, and the fact that we already have the ability to make certain predictions of the future with good accuracy, that God couldn't just predict the future with a high degree of accuracy.
Yep. So, for example, we as humans, we can predict things, right? Like, that's what the weather is. It's prediction of the future. We do it with pretty decent accuracy for the most part. To be fair, this isn't just about God predicting. It's about God knowing. So it's not just about God guessing. It's about God saying, I actually know that this is going to happen, and it will happen, right? There's a bit of a difference there and a nuance to how we understand omniscience. God is not just predicting something to happen. He knows it's going to happen. There is no degree of uncertainty.
Question, do people who hold this view think that God can guess, make educated guesses?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But wouldn't that imply that, but he has to either be right or wrong, right? So he can't make wrong guesses.
Correct. That's what all those scriptures were pointing at. In other words, all those scriptures were saying God made a guess, and his guess was wrong. So God said, oh, I didn't think you guys would actually relent from your sin. Oh, guess I don't have to punish you now. Right? See how that works? Yes, ma'am.
It's sort of like a devil's advocate argument that God can't know the future, but he can, declare that something's going to happen and then work things out so that it does happen and
Sure.
a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So that's one way open theists kind of get around this. They say God, and it's all his power. He's all powerful, right? He orchestrates certain things so that they happen in a certain way, right? If I arrange the chess pieces in this way, I will get this outcome later on. Essentially, that's sort of the argument here. God uses his omnipotence to overcome his lack of omniscience.
Then it seems kind of like if he did that, well then he might as well know the future because nothing's really able to stop God.
Sure, but that's what the scriptures say. Some things do seem to stop God, and this is where free will comes into play. Because the open theist would say, you all have free will. God can't know what you're going to choose. Because he can't know that, it's all fair game. You could choose something that shocks God. That's what those verses seem to indicate. Okay? Yes, sir.
It might let him off for the future, but he knows the present, so why does he just stop even the present?
Yeah, good point. He knows what's happening now, right? He sees me about to go stab Jackson. He could just kill me on the spot. That's well within God's power still. Why not just stop me now, as opposed to waiting for the future? Yeah, good points. This is where we stand in the debate. There are more positions. I'm not going to go over all of them because there's so many more. But these are some of your more popular positions I wanted to bring up to you. Maybe you're aware of them. Maybe you're not. I just simply want you to be aware. You don't have to choose. You have to choose eventually. But you don't have to choose tonight. All right? I want you guys to give it some thought. Where are we now? Currently, Lystra is the strongest contender that the Christians have. However, I said something last week about the state of the debate. Where is the state of the debate now? Stalemate. In chess, in a stalemate, what happens? It's a draw. Nobody wins. And we live in America. Somebody has to win, right?
Yeah, buddy.
The current state of the debate is that we are currently in a stalemate. And this is where things lie. The atheist claims that there are a lot of evils in the world, and some of these evils are gratuitous. At least they seem to be gratuitous. The Christian says, no, no, no. Skeptical theism, maybe there's a good, but we just simply don't know where the good is or where the good comes from. Well, wait a minute. Now we're at a stalemate. Neither side can prove their point. Remember, the argument is called the evidential argument, meaning from evidence. That's why it's called the evidential. The atheist is offering evidence. Remember, E1, E2, Bambi, and Sue, and all the other evils in the world. That's the atheist's evidence. The Christian has to come back now and offer their evidence. The Christian says, well, I can't, because we just simply can't know. It's not within our ability to know. Stalemate. How can we actually know? The atheist seems to think we can't, and the theist, the Christian, seems to think we can, but we may not be able to tell exactly where the goods are. Do you see kind of how we're at this weird point right now? Neither side can prove their point. We have reached a stalemate in the discussion. Maybe that's okay with you. I don't find that okay. I live in America, for one thing. But more importantly, last week I mentioned that I believe the Christian worldview to be the best worldview. It is the best perspective that I believe we can have on life. If you adopt it, you will understand truth and reality in a way that no other worldview can. If I truly believe that to be the case, I can't be okay with the stalemate. It's almost like admitting defeat, like saying we can't go any further than this. I think we need to push the scales and to tip them in the favor of the Christian in some way. Now, before I do that, I'll give you guys a chance. What do you think I hold? Where do you think I fall on this spectrum here? You don't have to get it all right, because you won't. But I'm just curious, after the talks we've had so far.
Maybe you feel like there has to be some sort of answer to the evil.
Okay, so maybe there has to be some sort of answer to the evil. Yeah, I would say that generally, not specifically. What else? Throw your guesses out there. Try to be like prediction. Try to be open theist today.
The evil can act as kind of a share in the sufferings of Christ.
Okay, so a sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Okay, you've probably heard that before. When I suffer, it's like Christ suffers, because Christ suffered on the cross, and he shares in our sufferings. I do believe that to some extent, but that is not the primary point. But that's a really good one, though. I like that one a lot. What else?
Maybe that suffering is due to some of our free will, like our free will, we can choose to do good, but also we can choose to do the evil just as much, and it's more of a result of that.
Okay, so I will admit I do hold to a very strong view of free will. I think that is a key part of who we are. I believe that we all have free will, and that you get to make choices every single day, freely, of your own volition, we would say. All right, let me ask one quick follow-up question here. For the skeptical theists and all the greater good people, do they say, or do they admit that gratuitous evils exist? No. Correct, they do not. The Christian who holds to a greater good believes that there are no such things as gratuitous evils. In other words, every evil has a purpose. That's the key point there. Every evil has a purpose. The atheists, do they believe gratuitous evils exist? Yes. Correct. They believe that gratuitous evils count against God's existence. In other words, the very existence of an evil that has no purpose is enough reason to believe God probably does not exist. That's the whole point of gratuitous evils.
What definition of atheism are you operating on?
Whichever one holds to gratuitous evils. I mean, the belief that there is no God.
Okay, because it doesn't seem like something every atheist I've encountered has actually held.
Well, we're operating here on Roe, specifically, because Roe is the one who brings up the idea of gratuitous evils in his evidential argument, right? That if there is even one instance of a gratuitous evil, an evil that has no purpose in it, why would God allow that? In other words, the whole point is, if God allows even one instance of this kind of evil, maybe he doesn't exist. They're not saying that he doesn't. It's not a definitive argument. Remember, this is a probability argument. His whole point is, if there is even one instance of gratuitous evils, it seems more likely that God does not exist. And remember, Roe uses two examples, Bambi and Sue. He says, I have two right here, right off the bat. I can name more if you want me to, but I got two right off the bat. If there is no greater good that seems to come out of Sue's suffering, we got an instance of gratuitous evil, and it really seems like God does not exist. All right, that's how the argument works. Let me show you guys my response. All right, you don't have to like it. You may hate it. That's fine too. That doesn't bother me. My position is what's called a creation order theodicy. I believe the greater good theodicy has some significant issues. Yeah, me personally. This is my professor, my major professor right here, Dr. Bruce Little. He's the one who's supervising me throughout my PhD. He essentially developed this position that he calls a creation order theodicy. He believes that the greater good fails. There are too many theological and philosophical problems in his mind. He says a number of disturbing theological and philosophical concerns surface upon close scrutiny of the greater good theodicy. The greater good premise itself is dubious, and furthermore requires the denial of gratuitous evil, forcing the theist into the impossible task of demonstrating this from the evidence or from the Bible. In other words, he says, if we play their game and we have to try to prove that there are no gratuitous evils, we find ourselves in a losing battle. We will never be able to pull it off. So, for Dr. Little, he came up with what he calls a creation order theodicy. It's an alternative to the greater good. All right? This is the position I hold. You do not have to hold this position. You do not have to hold this position. Be very clear here. I don't care what position you hold. It does not bother me. I just want you to be well thought out in your position. All right? My position also has significant problems I have to deal with, but that's for me to deal with. Unless you want to jump on board, then we can all deal with it together. All right? So creation order theodicy holds to a very unique type of knowledge that God has. We call that middle knowledge. What is middle knowledge? What is this weird word here? This by definition means that God has knowledge of all counterfactuals. What do I mean? Julian, I'm going to raise your board here. All right. Let's say, I'm going to use Jackson. I'm going to pick on Jackson more. This is Jackson's life. Jackson is moving along his life. You guys have done timelines in school, right? Okay, good. Like, draw little timelines. It's really cute. Eventually, you reach a point in your timeline where you have to make a decision. Jax, what decision do you have to make tonight?
Oh gosh.
Man, no decision.
Come to this or come to this or not come to this.
Good. That's an excellent decision you have to make. At some point in Jackson's life, he has to make a decision whether to come to this Ratio Christi event tonight or not. He can choose to come, and his life will go off in this direction, or he can choose to not come, and his life will go off in this direction. Middle knowledge says that God gives all of us free will. We can freely choose what we want to do at this point. This is a decision point. God knows what's going to happen if Jackson chooses this route, and God also knows what's going to happen if Jackson chooses this route. This is what he calls counterfactuals. In other words, one of these actually happens. So, for example, Jackson is here. Good for you, Jax. This does not exist. But God knows what would have happened if Jackson never came tonight. Jackson is probably playing at the rec center or doing something like that, or maybe he's watching a movie, right? God knows this. This is what we call middle knowledge. God knows of things that could have happened but didn't happen. All right? So this is how we understand God's omniscience. He knows all future things, even if they haven't happened yet, because God knows all things that could happen, in addition to what is happening. So we already understood this as part of this graph here, right? This is how we often think about timelines, right? When you guys make a timeline in elementary school, this is how you make them. Boom, 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 boom. Events happen one after the other, right? I want to argue that that's the wrong way to understand a timeline. Our lives are not often linear like that. Now, maybe you hold that. Maybe you hold that all things have been predetermined from start to finish. I don't. I hold to middle knowledge, meaning that I believe there are things that could have happened differently because I hold to a very strong view of free will. I think that's super important, that you have the ability to choose for yourself. You can choose to be here. You can choose to follow Jesus. You can choose who to marry one day in the future. You can choose where you're going to live. These are all choices that you get to make. So you can see here, really simple one, choice to eat an apple. You eat an apple, it goes off this way. You don't eat an apple, it goes off this way. All right? All right, let's talk about creation. The reason this is called a creation order theodicy is because I believe God created creation with a set of rules and order. That's where the order comes in. Cause and effect, if you will. In other words, when God created the universe, he created it in mind, knowing that there would be cause and effect, scientific laws that the world and creation have to follow. If I drop this marker, it will fall to the earth at what acceleration? Yeah, there you go. Very good. You guys know your physics here. Those are built-in laws, cause and effect. If I stab Jackson, I will go to jail. That is a cause and effect. But more than that, creation is actually like a syllabus. You guys all have syllabuses, right? You know how syllabuses work. Let me explain to you how they work in relation to this. The professor, or God, creates a syllabus, the world, and he sets the rules for it. Makes sense. When you go to class, your professor creates the syllabus and sets the rule for that class. What is an A? 90 to 100. If you talk in class without raising your hand, you get sent to the office or whatever, right? Think about how a syllabus works. It structures the class itself. And who sets the rules? The professor, not you. You're a student. You obey the syllabus. But wait a minute. You have the freedom to obey the syllabus. We all know of students in our classes that maybe acted up. Maybe that was you, right? You chose not to obey the syllabus. There were clear syllabus rules about eating in class, and you chose to disobey anyways, right? Or there are clear syllabus rules for what constitutes an A, B, C, D, or F. You chose to not do your homework. Now there's a consequence that comes along with that. As a student, us, in creation, we have the right or the freedom to act how we want in that course. We are limited by somewhat of the course structure. However, we still get to make choices. I can choose to fail the class if I want to. I can choose to turn in all my homework and pass my test and get an A in the course. Those are all choices I get to make myself. The professor does not make those choices for me. There are consequences for your choices. We already talked about this. You do all the work, you turn in all your assignments, you make an A. That's the consequence. Consequences aren't always bad things, right? Consequences can be good things. You act up in class. You eat food when you're not supposed to. You leave class early before you're supposed to. Now there are negative consequences. that are associated with that. You see how that works? Cause and effect. But this is all set up by the professor. But wait a second, that syllabus isn't always perfect. Or not perfect, that's a bad word. The syllabus can be adjusted on the fly. Have your professors ever done this before? Hey, an assignment's due tomorrow. Half the class isn't even close to being done with it. What does the professor do? We're going to extend the assignment by another week, right? The professor has every right to do so. The professor could also keep the assignment the same. He doesn't have to change it, or she, right? It doesn't matter what they choose. But they ultimately hold the power for any changes made to the syllabus. This idea of a creation order finds its best analogy in a syllabus. God is the professor or teacher who set up the course, creation, and we get to live in it. As part of our inhabitants of creation, we get to make choices. We're free to make choices. So this is why I say here, we have free will, but we are still limited in our free will. Jackson, can you choose to fly? You cannot. Nick, can you choose to live somewhere else right now?
Absolutely.
I wish you could. No, you can't, right? There are some things that you simply cannot change about your life. My parents are my parents. I have one sister. I am a male, right? There are some things I simply cannot choose. So we are limited. We're not given complete freedom to do what we want, but we are still given free will. We can still make choices, and there are still meaningful consequences for those choices. Furthermore, the natural laws that govern the universe are set by God. We can't change those, right? Gravity falls 9.8 meters per second, right? And then finally, God can choose to intervene in the world through miracles. I believe this is God stepping in when the syllabus needs an adjustment. Thinking of things like the flood, Tower of Babel, so on and so forth. All right? The big question that always gets brought up then, I'm going to try to explain this as best I can. This is the most confusing part here. How do we now understand God's will? God's will for your life. I'm going to move again. All right. When we talk about God's will, I believe we often think about God's will like a straight line. God's will for my life is to meet my wife, graduate, married, right? Whatever. This is God's will for my life. It is a straight line that goes straight across. In other words, God ordains and has already planned out every single detail of my life. I don't like that view. And on a creation order, we would say God's will should be understood almost as boundaries that govern our lives and creation. So God's will is more like this: boundaries. And our choices, or creation as a whole, goes through and goes up and down and up and down. These are the choices that we make throughout life. As long as they stay within God's will, no problem. God allows them to occur. But the moment they start to get close to escaping God's will, his boundary points, God intervenes. This is where I often say miracles come into play. So imagine that this is creation for a second here. These are all the choices that everyone is making at every point throughout time. As we approach the boundary of God's will, or the limit of God's will, God intervenes. Where does God intervene to push creation back into his will? I'm thinking of things here like the flood, the Tower of Babel specifically. All of these push creation back within his will. And as long as you keep making decisions here, you're good. So this can be understood in two ways. One is the larger creation as a whole. Creation stays within God's will. But this can also be understood individually. You Your life is full of little decisions that you make. Maybe God intervenes in your life in ways that you don't understand. Maybe that's to keep it within his will. Now, is this a weird way of thinking about God's will? Yes. But I think it gives us a better understanding of God's will, not as a straight line. In other words, there's no flexibility in God's will. I believe God allows us to make choices in our lives, and as long as they are good, they stay here. So in other words, Jackson could be going through life. He makes a decision here, he makes a decision here, he goes to NC State here, state, whatever. He gets up here, and then God says, no. I got to intervene, Jackson. You're about to step outside my will for your life. And then he makes him come to this Ratio Christi thing. Now Jackson's back in God's will. All right, see how that works?
So then, are you saying that Christians cannot do anything outside of God's will, period?
I would say creation as a whole cannot do anything outside of God's will.
So does that, how do you respond to sin then?
Yeah, we would say sin is part of creation. It's part of the creation order. It's kind of tricky to think about because you're like, well, wouldn't a world without sin be better? On a creation order, I would say we're all given free will. And as a result of free will, there has to be sin. Sin enters the world because of it. Because if you're going to give humans free will, they will, at some point, make a really bad decision. Really bad decision. And that's what we see in the fall. So more specifically, let me just give you guys some more details here. On a creation order, I do not claim that God cannot bring a greater good out of evil. I think that's fair. God does bring greater goods out of evil. We see that in Scripture. We see that sometimes in testimonies of people's lives. I don't think that's off the table. What I am saying is that not all evils have to result in a greater good. I hold that there can be gratuitous evils. Within God's created order, within God's will of creation, it is possible that there are evils that don't have a purpose. And it does not count against who God is. Because his created order is still good. That's the key. If his created order is good, then it's okay that there are gratuitous evils. In other words, they do not count against God's existence. So therefore, as a theist or a Christian, I don't have to prove that there's a greater good that must result from every single evil. That's because the creation is still good. The creation is still good. Julie?
On the individual level, if somebody goes outside of those guidelines of God's will, is that the person that ends up in hell?
Nope. I would say that is because God will never let anyone get outside of his will. His will is not so much of he left my will, therefore he's in hell. We can make choices within, and we can choose not to be a Christian. That is still within the boundary lines, we would say.
So our free will is kind of limited, almost on the edge of his.
Yep, exactly. Remember I mentioned earlier, the free will is limited, right? There are some things that limit our free will, and that I would think that is part of it.
And, okay, so somebody, though staying in those guidelines of God's will, may still end up in hell. You're not saying, though, that somebody is predestined, like God makes that person to go to hell. It's just that their free will ends them up in that position.
Correct. So, again, you can probably tell I'm not a Calvinist. I don't believe that God predetermines or presets anyone to hell or heaven, for that matter. I believe that is a choice that you make, and I think that's, for me, really important, that you make that choice. Maybe you disagree theologically, that's fine. I think that it's a really important choice to make because it has to be your choice to make, a free choice that you make. Do you have one real quick?
Yeah, so do you believe then that God doesn't know whether somebody will go to heaven or hell when they're born?
let me see how to answer this. Do I believe that God doesn't know whether someone will go to heaven or hell when they're born, right? Okay, so let me go back to the drawing board here. So we would say at birth, born, and then here is, we'll call it the salvation position, salvation decision, all right? I believe God knows all of this, and he knows whether or not yes or no. So in that sense, it's not so much that God doesn't know whether or not they will. He does not know the choice they've made. But he knows, regardless, if they said yes or if they said no, what that outcome would look like.
So he knows what the yes path looks like.
Correct.
He knows what the no path looks like, but he doesn't know which one.
Because we have not made that choice yet. Oh, so many questions now. I'll get you in the back there.
Hi, so I was thinking, if he just knows what could or could not happen, could you really say that he knows the true future then? Because he has a very distorted version of the future with everybody's choices not being particularly clear.
Okay, so does God know, is this true omniscience? Is kind of what you're asking, right? Like, how can God truly be omniscient if he doesn't know? I would say, I think this is omniscience in the sense that he knows the future. He knows what will happen if this happens, and he knows what will happen if this happens. The future is what we would say in philosophy, it is not actualized yet. In other words, the future has not been determined. So in my view, I don't think this lessens omniscience. I think it still gives him full omniscience. He knows the yes or the no. But it's up to you to decide which reality is actually going to happen.
So, I actually have two questions.
Yeah.
First, does this mean that all of God's decisions are reactive rather than proactive?
No, because we would say God still knows from the beginning all the possibilities that could or could not happen. God intervenes based on the decision that's made. And he already knows that from the beginning.
Does he know a decision that's going to be made or not?
He does not know the decision. He just knows which possibilities are possible. So in other words, he doesn't know that you've made a decision for salvation one way or the other. He just simply knows if you choose yes or if you choose no. And I would also say, if you choose yes, God has already planned certain things based on your yes. If you say no, God's already planned certain things based on your no.
So he's made a plan given that you went down the yes path, but hasn't made a decision to affect the outcome of whether it's a yes or a no.
Correct, because it hasn't happened yet. Once it happens, then we continue on that path.
So some of what he does is proactive and some is reactive.
No, because we would still say he knows from the beginning all the decisions that are possible. In other words, there is no decision made that God doesn't already know the result of. But it hasn't happened yet, so he cannot react accordingly. I know it's kind of weird.
I find it kind of weird.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah, let me get you back.
What would you do with Bible verses? I'd have to look up the specific ones that say things like salvation. I'm gonna get it wrong, but there's some verse about like those whom he foreknew that seems to be specifically referring to those who would accept salvation.
Yeah, so we're thinking about things like God, those who God foreknew, or the Book of Life. Name your pick, right? I do understand that there are Bible verses used in support of Calvinism in terms of predeterminism specifically. I think those verses can be interpreted in this framework. God knows of all those. He knows of those that are elect, but they have not yet made their decision yet. He knows of the yes that they would make, but it's ultimately up to them to still make that decision regardless. So in other words, when God looks from eternity past, before he creates, there are millions, billions, trillions, an almost endless number of decisions. God knows all of those. And so I would say God foreknows all those decisions, but it's your choice which decision path you head down. Yes, sir.
Would you say that God is in time?
Man, getting us into a time debate here. To keep it short, because I don't really want to get into a conversation about time, I say yes and no. God exists outside of time, but he still interacts within time once it's created. So yes and no. Just keep it short. Jackson.
So then, is prophecy basically God's calculus on every possible decision that could ever be made?
Good question.
So are you saying that basically there are infinite number of possible decisions for every possible decision? God knows all of those, and so his actions are set in such a way that prophecies are fulfilled or haven't been fulfilled.
So I would say there are two ways to look at prophecy. One is sort of the way you say, in that, well, there are some things that if God already knows it's going to happen, they're going to happen. I also think that there are some events that we call necessary events. If you ever watch Loki, we would call them nexus events, right? Things that have to happen. In my opinion, the biggest one is the cross. On my view of the creation order, the cross happens in every single choice, no matter what choice is made. Jesus comes, he dies on the cross, and he's resurrected on the third day. I believe that there are other events like this. I can't prove a lot of them with certainty, but I do think that the cross and Jesus' sacrifice is a necessary event. It had to happen.
Bit of a pivot from the previous question. How does that model of the theodicy is to answer word? How does that answer the evil classified as natural and physical evils, things where like natural disasters where free will is not quite as relevant to their occurrence?
Yeah, good question. So the question is, how do we deal with things like natural and physical evils, right? If you notice, most of the responses have tried to deal with moral evils that we do to one another. I'm just going to say up here and admit, physical and naturals are the hardest thing for me to deal with. It is. I don't know that the creation order has a great response. I think it's a little bit better than others. I would say on a creation order, on this response here, creation is set in a certain way. There are effects of the fall. When man, so let's say this fall back here. When man makes the choice, when Adam and Eve make the choice, creation falls along with them, right? We would see that in Genesis 3. We read about how creation groans and seems to almost be like suffering. So in some sense, we could attribute some of that to like hurricanes, tornadoes, to the results of the fall. We could attribute some of that, things like cancer, COVID, whatever, name your pick, leukemia. We could attribute some of that to the fall. I have a problem with that when it comes to specifically things like children suffering. That is the hardest one to deal with, specifically things like child cancer, kids who die early from sickness, kids who die in natural disasters. Why couldn't God have protected them? But on the creation order, remember, I don't have to say that those are gratuitous evils that count against God. All I have to say is, well, it was still within God's created order. It was still a good creation. There are gratuitous evils. Sometimes the effects or the consequences of the fall may be natural disasters, cancer, sickness. If those are the results of the fall, and if we don't really have a purpose for them, maybe they're gratuitous. And if they're gratuitous, on my view, it doesn't have to count against God. It is just the groaning of a creation that longs for its creator to come back.
If God is since God is the creator of life and he has every right to remove life, would you say that God taking somebody back that we would say is too early, like say it's a child, we think it's injustice because it's before their time, would that be an example of God stepping in and acting in order to keep everything within the guidelines of his will?
It could be. There is, I hate to say it, a little bit of a mystery here of does God intervene to do things like that, to take a child before certain things get out of whack? Maybe. I think it's just, at least on my view, it's easier to just say that's not part of God's plan these are just things that happen in a broken creation, but it doesn't mean that God is at fault for not intervening. God may intervene. We do hear stories of God intervening, right? Children are miraculously saved. Cancer, miraculously gone. But does that happen in every case? No, it sure doesn't, right? We know of plenty of people who suffer and die, and there is no reason for it. So I don't have to claim there's a reason. As long as the created order is still good, as long as everything stays within the boundary lines, I think God is still who he says he is. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that Jesus had free will?
I'm going to answer this as quickly as I can to get out of. I think yes and no. He has the freedom to choose. We see this when Satan takes him up and tempts him, right? The 3 temptations. But he, in a sense, doesn't, because he is bound by his divine nature of being God himself. Jesus will never choose sin because he is divine and holy in and of himself. So in that sense, it's not that he doesn't have free will, but that his nature kind of commands what he will do. Yes, ma'am.
Could it be like maybe Jesus could choose whether to have chocolate or vanilla ice cream?
Oh, sure.
And that's fine, but he can't choose to sin versus not sin.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, we would say Jesus can choose things like that. Maybe we see that through the Gospels. Jesus makes a choice to go to this town instead of this town, right? I don't think that was necessarily a bad or a good choice. It was a choice he made, and now there are consequences that result from that choice. But he is still God. We don't ever want to discount his divine nature just because he's able to make free choices. Same thing with God. We would say God can make free choices, but God still makes the best choice possible because he is God. All right? Okay, let me finish up here because I know it's running late. I don't want you guys to fall asleep on me. All right, a couple of quick things here, and then if you have any more follow-up questions, I'm happy to take them. Why believe this view? I believe there are some benefits here. We avoid many of the problems with the greater good theodicy. I think you kind of hear me say that. I don't have to defend a greater good for every single evil that happens. I also believe this allows for human free will and God's sovereignty. This is always the trickiest one that we have to deal with. How is God sovereign, and yet we seem to be able to make choices of our own volition? We avoid the weakness of the gratuitous evil. In other words, it doesn't count against God anymore. I don't have to worry about that. I can just admit it. And so notice what that does if I don't have to worry about gratuitous evils. Remember that stalemate we talked about? Now the scales are tipping a little bit. Now it seems like the Christian has a stronger position because I don't have to worry about gratuitous evils. That was the key argument the atheist hangs on to. We don't always have to look for the good. And what I mean is when we suffer, when others suffer, we don't point them to some greater good that may or may not be promised. I don't know if I shared this story last time, but my major professor, Dr. Little, was a pastor for a number of years. One time or one night, he got a phone call from a woman, not in his church. Her husband had just committed suicide, shot himself, and he showed up at the house, right? Just gave a little pastoral care while he was there. Again, not a member of his church or anything. The pastor of the church shows up to this woman's house, and the very first words out of his mouth after he kind of surveys the room and looks around at, the scene, he says to the woman and says, "Don't you worry, God is going to bring some greater good out of this evil, this event that happened." My professor could not believe what he heard, and he essentially said, now, instead of looking to God for comfort, this woman is always going to be searching for this good that may or may not happen. Who's to say that there is actually a greater good coming for this woman? Does this pastor know? Can he point to it? Can he make the connection for this lady? What if it never comes and she spends her whole life searching for a greater good that never occurs? How is that loving in any way? All we've done is we've shifted our focus from God to the good. So he says, we don't always have to look for the good now. When we suffer, we don't look so that we have something greater coming. we look to the comfort that God provides. And so this is kind of to your point originally of, well, maybe we can find our shared suffering in Christ. There is a little bit of that here, because I think that matters more, because God understands your hurt so much more than you searching for some greater good that may or may never show up. And if it does show up, great, but if it doesn't, I think you've sort of lost the focus in your life. And so that's my last point here. We direct our attention to God during our times of suffering. I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer, but you will suffer. The older you get, the more suffering comes your way. This is either personally or it's with loved ones that you know. I hate to say it, but the older you get, the more stories of like cancer, people dying, grandparents passing away, it just happens so much more regularly the older you get. At some point, you have to decide what works for you. If the greater good works for you, fantastic. I hope you find great comfort in Jesus in that. I personally don't think it works for me. That's why the creation order was very attractive to me. It was an alternative response. I think it has biblical weight to it. In other words, it's still within biblical support. I think it's philosophically sound, and I don't have to worry about gratuitous evils being a reason for God not to exist. If it works for you, come on board. We can talk about it some more. But ultimately, you have to make a decision on what works. So, my final thoughts. This is a significant topic for all of us. At some point, you will have to deal with this, like I mentioned many times now. And I think you need to have a satisfying response for yourself. It's more complicated than you may think, right? I've spent 2 weeks on this. Thank you, Julian, for giving me 2 weeks. This is a significantly complex topic because it touches on so much theology, so much philosophy. It's good. It's good for us to think about these things. Whatever your view, give it serious critical thinking and reflection. We're not out here to prove other people wrong. So if someone else holds a different view than you, that's okay. Your apologetics is ultimately for you, not for anybody else. You may use it to help answer questions that unbelievers bring up, but apologetics has to be done first for yourself. You have to do it so that you can feel secure in your own faith. And then finally, we engage others with this topic. I'm going to give you guys some books to look at. So this book here is by my professor. This is his book, The Creation Order Theodicy. If you want his full description of it, it's there. I actually have it here too. It's not too long. This is his academic version of it. If you want to go hard into it, he goes hard into it with theological concepts and philosophy here. Great recommendation. What is this one then? This is the exact same book, just for a more popular audience. So if you don't want all the crazy theology and stuff, this is kind of more they asked him to rewrite it, so it would be more accessible, all right? This one, actually, I would definitely recommend. It is easy to read. It's only like 150 pages. It's a fantastic little book. He does the same thing that I just did. Greater goods, do they work? He thinks they don't. He gives the reasons why he thinks they don't work. And then he offers his creation order at the very end with a little bit more detail. If you want a really great book on how to process and walk through suffering, Tim Keller's Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. I believe he wrote this in the midst of his battle with cancer, so it's very poignant. It's pretty long, but it's Tim Keller, so you know you're going to be blessed anyways. So I would definitely read it. It's basically his walk through suffering. And then if you want to get real deep into the weeds, The Problem of Evil, this one's by Peterson. It's called Selected Readings. It has a bunch of different authors that write on the problem of evil from a very high level perspective. So if you really want to go super deep into it, that would be my next recommendation. I've got some questions here for discussion if you want. It is like 8:50. I'm happy to take some questions afterwards, but I think we can call it here. So if you guys want to get out of here, you don't have to feel like you're being held hostage. So I'm super thankful to have you guys here and let me come talk to y'all. So if you guys want to talk more, I'm up here. Love to chat with you guys a little bit more if we can. All right? Thank you guys.